What if I told you that one of history's most tragic rulers ascended to the throne of the most powerful empire on earth, only to vanish from existence just 9 days later? A pharaoh whose brief reign was so catastrophic that his name was deliberately erased from royal records, his monuments destroyed, and his very existence denied by those who came after him. This is not fiction. This is the true story of a ruler whose fleeting moment of power would shake the foundations of ancient Egypt and whose mysterious fate continues to baffle historians today. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will reveal how 9 days can change the course of an entire civilization, and why this forgotten pharaoh's story matters more than you might imagine. The year was 1323 before Christ. The sun blazed over the Valley of the Kings as it had for millennia, casting long shadows across limestone cliffs where the greatest rulers of the ancient world lay entombed in golden splendor. Egypt stood as the unchallenged superpower of the Bronze Age world, its wealth flowing from Nubian gold mines, its armies feared from Syria to Sudan, its monuments touching the very heavens themselves. But beneath this facade of eternal strength, the greatest dynasty in human history was crumbling. The bloodline of pharaohs that had ruled for over 1,400 years was about to face its darkest hour. Palace corridors that once echoed with confident footsteps now whispered with conspiracies. Royal chambers that had witnessed the birth of legends were about to become the stage for one of history's most mysterious tragedies. In the royal palace at Memphis, a young man was about to inherit a throne that came with a deadly price. He would become Pharaoh of Egypt, Lord of the Two Lands, son of Ra himself. But his reign would last exactly 9 days before he disappeared forever, leaving behind only questions that have haunted archaeologists for over 3 millennia. This is the story of how power, betrayal, and ancient secrets converged in those 9 fateful days to change Egypt forever. It's a tale that reveals the brutal reality behind the golden mask of pharaonic power, where youth meant vulnerability, and where the gods themselves seemed to have abandoned their chosen ruler. But to understand how a pharaoh could vanish so completely that his name became forbidden to speak, we must first journey back to where this tragedy began, in the golden courts of the most powerful family the world had ever known. The story begins not with our doomed pharaoh, but with the most famous ruler in Egyptian history, Tutankhamun, the boy king whose golden death mask would one day captivate the modern world, had just died at the tender age of 19. The year was 1323 before Christ, and with his death, a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for over 3 centuries was hanging by the thinnest of threads. Tutankhamun had been more than just a pharaoh. He was the living embodiment of divine kingship, the bridge between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. His death left Egypt facing an unprecedented crisis. He had died without an heir, without a son to carry forward the sacred bloodline that legitimized pharaonic rule. In a civilization where the pharaoh was literally considered a god on earth, this was not merely a political problem, it was a cosmic catastrophe. The palace at Memphis had become a powder keg of ambition and desperation. Courtiers who had spent their lives bowing before divine authority suddenly found themselves staring into a power vacuum that threatened to swallow the entire kingdom. The priesthood of Ammonius, the most powerful religious faction in Egypt, watched nervously as their divine mandate seemed to crumble with each passing hour. Foreign enemies circled like vultures, sensing weakness in the empire that had dominated the ancient world for over a millennium. Into this chaos stepped a woman whose very existence challenged everything Egyptian society believed about power and divinity. Enkhesinemen, the teenage widow of Tutankhamun, was not content to fade quietly into the shadows of widowhood. She was the daughter of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, a woman who had witnessed firsthand how quickly pharaonic power could be gained and lost. More importantly, she was the last direct link to the royal bloodline that had made Egypt the envy of the ancient world. But Enkhesinemen faced an impossible situation. Egyptian law and tradition demanded that the pharaoh be male. Yet she possessed something even more valuable than gender. She carried the blood of kings in her veins, and whoever married her would gain an unassailable claim to the throne of Egypt. She had become the most valuable woman in the ancient world, and also the most vulnerable. The palace corridors buzzed with whispered conversations as Egypt's most powerful men calculated their chances. Each faction had its candidate, each priest had his preference, and each general had his ambitions. The Vizier I, an elderly courtier who had served 3 pharaohs, believed his decades of service entitled him to the crown. The General Horemheb, commander of Egypt's mighty armies, felt that only military strength could hold the empire together. Both men were old enough to be grandfathers, yet both harbored dreams of divine kingship. But there was another player in this deadly game of thrones, one whose very existence would prove to be both salvation and doom for ancient Egypt. Hidden in the royal genealogies was a young man whose bloodline made him a legitimate heir to the throne. His name appears only briefly in ancient records, mentioned in passing as if the scribes themselves were afraid to write it down. We know him today as Smenkhkare, though even this name remains shrouded in mystery and scholarly debate. Smenkhkare was young, possibly still a teenager, and bore the sacred blood that made pharaonic rule possible. He may have been Tutankhamun's brother, or perhaps a close cousin. The exact relationship remains one of archaeology's most tantalizing mysteries. What we do know is that he possessed the one thing that neither I nor Horemheb could claim: legitimate royal lineage that stretched back through the 18th dynasty to the great pharaohs who had built Egypt's empire. The temples of Thebes had begun performing the elaborate rituals required to crown a new pharaoh. The priests of Ammonius Ra chanted ancient hymns that had echoed through these same halls for countless generations. Sacred oils were prepared, golden regalia was polished, and the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt was readied for its next wearer. The gods themselves seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see who would dare claim divinity. In the royal workshops, craftsmen worked feverishly to prepare the symbols of kingship. The crook and flail, ancient symbols of pharaonic authority, were cleaned and blessed. The cobra and vulture that would adorn the royal crown were carved with meticulous care, for they represented the protective goddesses who watched over every legitimate ruler of Egypt. Even the royal sandals were crafted with golden thread, because the pharaoh's feet must never touch common ground. But beneath all this ceremonial preparation, darker forces were already moving. The transition of power in ancient Egypt was never simply a matter of bloodline and ritual. It was a complex dance of political alliances, religious authority, and military might. Those who possessed all three could rule with confidence. Those who lacked even one faced a precarious existence on the throne that had already claimed the lives of several pharaohs. What none of them could have predicted was that the young man about to claim the throne carried within him a secret that would make his reign not just brief, but utterly catastrophic, setting in motion events that would lead to one of the most mysterious disappearances in all of human history. The coronation of Smenkhkare took place at dawn, as tradition demanded, when the sun god Ra began his daily journey across the heavens. The ceremony unfolded in the great temple of Ammonius at Thebes, where massive columns carved with hieroglyphs stretched toward the sky like frozen prayers. Priests in white linen robes moved through rituals that had remained unchanged for over 1,000 years, their voices echoing through chambers where dozens of pharaohs had received their divine mandate. The young pharaoh knelt before the high priest as sacred oils were poured over his head, each drop carrying the weight of divine approval. The double crown was placed upon his brow, the white crown of Upper Egypt joined with the red crown of Lower Egypt, symbolizing his dominion over a unified kingdom that stretched from the cataracts of Nubia to the Mediterranean shores. The crook and flail were pressed into his hands, transforming him from mortal man into living God. But even as the ancient words of consecration were spoken, those present could sense that something was fundamentally wrong. The young pharaoh's hands trembled as he held the sacred implements. His voice cracked when he spoke the ritual responses that would bind him to the gods forever. Some attributed this to youth and inexperience, but the most perceptive observers noticed something far more troubling: fear. What they didn't know was that Smenkhkare had already received information that would have chilled the blood of any pharaoh. Through a network of spies that stretched from Memphis to the borders of the Hittite Empire, disturbing reports had reached the palace. The Hittites, Egypt's greatest enemies, had learned of Tutankhamun's death and were mobilizing their armies. Worse still, they had received intelligence about the succession crisis and were planning to exploit Egypt's moment of vulnerability. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma, a brilliant military strategist who had spent decades plotting Egypt's downfall, saw an opportunity that might never come again. His spies had infiltrated the Egyptian court and were feeding him detailed information about the power struggle between Horemheb, and the young pharaoh. More dangerously, they had identified key Egyptian nobles who might be persuaded to switch sides if the price was right. But the external threat was only half of Smenkkare's problems. Within the palace walls, a far more immediate danger was taking shape. The letter that would seal his fate had already been written, though he remained unaware of its existence. Enkesenamen, the young widow who held the key to legitimacy, had made a decision that would shock the ancient world and ultimately lead to the destruction of everyone involved. Desperate to avoid being forced into marriage with either the elderly or the ruthless Horemheb, Enkesenamen had committed what amounted to treason against her own kingdom. In a letter written on papyrus and sealed with her personal cartouche, she had reached out to Egypt's greatest enemy with an offer that defied all logic and tradition. She proposed to marry a Hittite prince, thereby handing control of Egypt to a foreign dynasty. The letter had been intercepted by Egyptian intelligence agents before it reached the Hittite court, but its contents had spread through the palace like poison. The very thought that a member of the royal family would consider such betrayal sent shockwaves through the established order. Some courtiers called for her immediate execution, while others saw an opportunity to use this scandal to advance their own ambitions. General Hormheb, commander of Egypt's military forces, was among the first to learn of the letter's contents. His reaction was swift and calculating. Rather than expose the queen's treachery immediately, he chose to use this information as leverage. He began meeting secretly with key military commanders, painting a picture of a dynasty so corrupt and desperate that even its own members were willing to sell Egypt to foreign powers. Meanwhile, the vizier faced his own crisis of conscience. He had served the royal family faithfully for decades, but Smenkhkare's letter forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. The dynasty he had spent his life protecting was crumbling from within. The young pharaoh, despite his legitimate bloodline, was proving to be weak and indecisive. The kingdom needed strong leadership, and tradition demanded that he, as senior vizier, step forward to provide it. As Smenkhkare entered his third day as pharaoh, he remained largely ignorant of the conspiracies swirling around him. His advisors had decided to shield him from the worst news, hoping to give him time to grow into his role. This well-intentioned deception would prove to be a fatal mistake. While the young pharaoh focused on mastering court ceremonies and religious obligations, his enemies were moving pieces into position for a game he didn't even know he was playing. The temples had begun reporting disturbing omens. Priests claimed that sacred animals were behaving strangely, that the Nile's annual flood showed troubling signs, and that the stars themselves seemed out of alignment. In a civilization that interpreted every natural phenomenon as a message from the gods, these reports carried enormous weight. Some began to whisper that the gods themselves were rejecting the new pharaoh, that his coronation had been a mistake that required immediate correction. Foreign ambassadors at court sent urgent dispatches to their home kingdoms, reporting that Egypt appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for centuries were showing signs of disruption. Tribute payments from vassal states began arriving late or not at all, as local rulers sensed weakness and began testing the boundaries of Egyptian authority. By the 5th day of his reign, Smenkhkare had begun to grasp the magnitude of the crisis he had inherited. Reports reached him of Nubian tribes massing near Egypt's southern borders, of Syrian city-states declaring independence, and of Libyan raiders conducting increasingly bold attacks on Egyptian settlements. The empire that had seemed eternal and invincible was revealing itself to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The young pharaoh called for an emergency council meeting, summoning his most trusted advisors to address the growing threats. It was during this meeting that the full scope of the conspiracy against him would finally be revealed, setting in motion the events that would lead to his mysterious disappearance and the near collapse of one of history's greatest civilizations. However, what was about to unfold in that council chamber would surpass everyone's darkest expectations and reveal secrets that had remained hidden for over 3 millennia, secrets so dangerous that those who discovered them would pay with their lives. The council chamber where Smenkkare's fate would be sealed was a masterpiece of ancient Egyptian architecture. Walls covered in gold leaf reflected the light of dozens of oil lamps, while hieroglyphs depicting the victories of previous pharaohs seemed to watch silently from every surface. Here, in this sacred space where the greatest decisions of empire had been made for centuries, the shortest reign in Egyptian history was about to reach its devastating conclusion. On the 7th day of his reign, Smenkhkare entered the chamber believing he was meeting with his most trusted advisors to address the growing crisis. Instead, he walked into a carefully orchestrated trap that had been months in the making. The men seated around the ornate cedar table were not just his advisors, they were his executioners, and the trial that was about to unfold would make a mockery of every principle of divine kingship that Egypt held sacred. Vizier I rose first, his aged voice carrying the weight of decades spent in service to the crown. But the words that emerged were not those of a loyal servant. With cold precision, he presented evidence of the royal family's unfitness to rule. He spoke of Smenkhkare's treacherous letter to the Hittites, of the economic chaos that had followed Tutankhamun's death, and of the military disasters that were already beginning to unfold on Egypt's borders. Each accusation struck like a physical blow, systematically dismantling the young pharaoh's authority. General Hormheb stood next, his scarred hands gesturing toward maps that showed Egyptian territories already lost to foreign invaders. His words painted a picture of an empire in free fall, of Egyptian soldiers dying because their divine leader lacked the strength to inspire them to victory. He spoke of Nubian gold mines falling to rebel forces, of Syrian vassal states declaring independence, and of Libyan raiders penetrating deeper into Egyptian territory than ever before. But it was the high priest of Ammonius who delivered the most devastating blow. In a voice that had blessed dozens of pharaohs, he declared that the gods themselves had withdrawn their favor from the royal bloodline. He cited the disturbing omens that had plagued Egypt since Smenkkare's coronation: sacred bulls refusing to eat, the sacred lake at Karnak turning an ominous red color, and most damning of all, the failure of the Nile's flood to reach its expected height. In a civilization where the pharaoh's divine connection directly influenced the kingdom's prosperity, these signs were interpreted as clear evidence of cosmic rejection. Smenkhkare listened to these accusations with growing horror. He had ascended to the throne believing in his divine right to rule, only to discover that divinity itself could be weaponized against him. The very priests who had crowned him just days earlier were now using religious authority to justify his removal. The generals who had sworn oaths of loyalty were presenting military necessity as grounds for betrayal. The advisors who had guided his first steps as pharaoh were revealing themselves as architects of his destruction. The young pharaoh's attempt to defend himself only accelerated his downfall. His voice, still changing with adolescence, cracked as he tried to assert his authority. His hands shook as he pointed to the royal regalia that should have guaranteed his position. Every word he spoke seemed to confirm his critics' assertions about his unfitness to rule an empire that spanned half the known world. The truth that emerged in that chamber was more shocking than anyone had anticipated. The conspirators revealed that they had been planning this coup since before Tutankhamun's death. They had allowed Smenkhkare to be crowned specifically so they could destroy him publicly, using his brief reign as justification for overthrowing the entire royal bloodline. The 9 days had never been intended as a genuine opportunity to rule. They had been a carefully calculated period designed to demonstrate the necessity of change. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. As the accusations mounted and Smenkkare's position became increasingly hopeless, one final secret was unveiled that would change everything. Hidden among the royal genealogies was evidence that Smenkkare's claim to the throne was not as legitimate as everyone had believed. Ancient documents, carefully preserved in the temple archives, suggested that his bloodline had been contaminated by foreign influence generations earlier. The implications were staggering. If true, this meant that not only was Smenkhkare unfit to rule, but that his entire family line had been living a lie for decades. The divine mandate that legitimized pharaonic power had been based on fraudulent claims that made a mockery of Egypt's most sacred traditions. The gods had not withdrawn their favor; they had never granted it in the first place. As the 8th day of his reign dawned, Smenkhkare found himself utterly alone. The palace guards who had sworn to protect him with their lives now avoided eye contact when he passed. The servants who had once rushed to fulfill his every command moved slowly and reluctantly, as if serving a man already dead. Even the royal food tasters, whose very existence depended on the pharaoh's survival, began to show signs of nervousness that suggested they knew something he did not. The final blow came not from his enemies, but from the one person he had trusted above all others. Queen Smenkhkare, whose marriage to him had legitimized his claim to the throne, appeared in his private chambers on the evening of the 8th day. The conversation that followed would be recorded by palace scribes who witnessed it from behind decorative screens, though their accounts would later be deliberately destroyed. Smenkhkare revealed that she had never intended to honor their marriage beyond the political necessity it served. More devastatingly, she confessed that her letter to the Hittites had been part of a larger plan orchestrated by Ai and Hormheb to create the justification they needed for regime change. She had been a willing participant in the conspiracy from the beginning, using her royal blood as bait to lure Smenkhkare into a trap from which there could be no escape. The young pharaoh's world collapsed in that moment. He realized that his entire reign had been an elaborate fiction, a theatrical performance designed to justify the coup that was about to destroy him. The crown he wore was not a symbol of divine authority but a target painted on his head. The palace he called home had become his tomb, and the gods he served had abandoned him to mortal enemies who showed no mercy. As the 9th day of his reign began, Smenkhkare made a decision that would echo through history. Rather than wait for his enemies to strike, he chose to disappear on his own terms, walking out of the palace in the pre-dawn darkness and vanishing into the desert that stretched endlessly beyond the green ribbon of the Nile. What happened to him in those final hours remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries, but the consequences of his disappearance would reshape the ancient world. The aftermath of those 9 days would prove that sometimes the briefest moments in history can have the most profound consequences, setting in motion events that would transform not just Egypt, but the entire balance of power in the ancient world. The 9 days that shook ancient Egypt had consequences that rippled through history for centuries to come. Smenkkare's mysterious disappearance into the desert marked not just the end of his brief reign, but the violent conclusion of the 18th dynasty that had made Egypt the greatest power the world had ever known. Within weeks of his vanishing, The carefully orchestrated coup reached its inevitable conclusion as I seized the throne, beginning a reign that would be marked by paranoia, purges, and the systematic erasure of his predecessor's existence. The new pharaoh's first act was to order the destruction of every monument, inscription, and official record that bore Smenkkare's name. Royal cartouches were chiseled away from temple walls, statues were smashed into fragments, and papyrus documents were burned in great ceremonial fires. The young pharaoh who had ruled for 9 days was being systematically deleted from history, as if his reign had been nothing more than a nightmare that Egypt needed to forget. But the conspirators had underestimated the forces they had unleashed. Smenkhkare, the queen whose treacherous letter had provided justification for the coup, found herself trapped by the very plot she had helped to orchestrate. I forced her into marriage, claiming legitimacy through her royal blood, but the union was doomed from the start. Within months, she too had vanished from the historical record, her fate as mysterious as that of the pharaoh she had betrayed. The Hittites, who had been preparing to exploit Egypt's weakness, found themselves facing not the vulnerable kingdom they had expected, but a militarized state under Horemheb's iron control. The general, who had waited patiently for his moment, eventually overthrew Ai and established a new dynasty built on military might rather than divine bloodline. His reign would restore Egypt's strength, but at the cost of the mystical authority that had made pharaonic rule truly unique in the ancient world. Modern archaeologists continue to search for evidence of Smenkkare's final fate. Some believe his mummy lies hidden in an undiscovered tomb in the Valley of the Kings, while others theorize that he fled Egypt entirely, perhaps establishing a new life in distant lands beyond the reach of his enemies. Recent excavations have uncovered fragments of pottery bearing his cartouche in locations far from traditional royal burial sites, suggesting that his story may not have ended in the desert after all. The broader lesson of these 9 days extends far beyond ancient Egypt. They remind us that power, no matter how absolute it appears, remains fundamentally vulnerable to human ambition and betrayal. The same forces that destroyed Smenkhkare, political conspiracy, religious manipulation, and military coup, continue to shape our world today. The methods may have evolved, but the underlying dynamics of power remain disturbingly familiar. Perhaps most significantly, Smenkkare's story reveals how quickly historical truth can be manipulated or erased entirely. For over 3,000 years, his reign was lost to history, known only through fragmentary evidence and educated speculation. It was only through the painstaking work of modern archaeologists and historians that his story began to emerge from the shadows where his enemies had tried to bury it forever. The 9 days that changed Egypt forever serve as a powerful reminder that history belongs not just to the victors who write it, but to the forgotten voices whose stories deserve to be remembered. In rescuing Smenkhkare from historical oblivion, we honor not just his memory, but our responsibility to seek truth even when it has been deliberately hidden. Stories like this show us that the past is more alive than we imagine, and each archaeological discovery brings us closer to understanding the human dramas that shaped our world, proving that even the briefest moments in history can teach us profound lessons about power, betrayal, and the eternal human struggle for truth. If you made it this far and aren't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe now, hit that like button, and share in the comments what you think really happened to Smenkhkare during those final hours in the desert. Did he escape to live another life, or did the sands of Egypt claim their youngest pharaoh forever? Until the next video.